Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So begins the Sermon on the Mount. So begins the famous Beatitudes. So begins Jesus' teaching of what it means to be his follower. And so also begins the indictment of our own shortcomings and those of our community and society. We began our reading this morning with Micah chapter 6. Now, Justice Knox uses verse 8 to help us understand the role of working for justice as equal to our works of mercy and our works of worship. And it's interesting to hear the Micah verse 8, which is the walk humbly verse, do justice, to hear it in the context of what Micah is saying, God's will is not. So someone is pleading with God, what should I do? Should I give sacrifices? How about 10,000 vats of oil? How about my firstborn child? And that wasn't a tongue-in-cheek. There was child sacrifice during the sort of early days of the Middle East, the ancient days, I should say. But God says, no, I don't desire any of that. I don't desire all your sacrifices, all your pious acts. There's only three things I desire: to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. In the Zen tradition, the Zen teacher will often rebuke the student saying, I don't want to hear anything from your lips. I want to see it in your life. I want to see it in your acts. It's not the fragrance of incense. It's not pious prayers that I desire. It's caring for the poor, for the widow, for the orphan, for the stranger. For you too were once strangers. And so our Beatitudes, Jesus is teaching, he's really telling us what it means to follow him, what it means to follow God's will. Remember the famous line, right? Jesus says, I want you to also take up your cross and follow me. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said what the Beatitudes really are is what it means to live the life of the cross. What it means to be empty as Jesus was empty. What it means to surrender as Jesus surrenders. What it means really to be a disciple. And we didn't get to hear it last week, but last week was Matthew's Gospel's version of the first call of the disciples. Okay, so this teaching is happening right after the call. And in this, Jesus is going, and James and Peter and others are mending nets. They maybe just got in from a fishing expedition, I don't know. And they're called from their work of catching fish. Later, Matthew himself, the author of the gospel, or the traditional author of the gospel, is called from his work as a tax collector. They're called out of the economy to live this different life. Following Jesus will force you to break from your patterns, break from your habits, break from your comfortable ways. You will not be focused on your nets, but on your neighbors. And so now he calls his disciples to sit down at his feet. And he's going to tell them how different they're to be. Blessed are the poor in spirit. So what does this word blessed mean? Okay, so in the Greek, the word is makarios, okay? And it was used in sort of Hesiod and others, meaning Greek author Hesiod, and others, to describe what it's like to be a god, okay? So what the God's life is like, it's makarios, Now, incidentally, it's also used to describe what it's like to be dead. Okay? So the idea being is that you're free of all the worries of life. Okay? That you're blissful and happy. I'm not sure I exactly agree with that as a good characterization of what it means to be happy, but that's the way the word was used. It was really divine happiness. It was like total fulfillment. So Jesus is declaring the poor in spirit to be blessed. And so in doing so, he's like reversing what we normally think. And the word for poor in that phrase, that Greek word, is, by the way, starts with a P. And actually the first 4 blessings, all of the things start with a P. Okay, I think this one's Patokos or something like that. And then meek is like paro. And mourning is like pinio, like pine, where we get our, we're pining for something. And then the 4th one is another P. But anyway, these are 4 Ps. That's just kind of cool if you like that sort of stuff. Anyway, the first word, poor, which in Greek is like tokos or something like that, means literally economically destitute, okay? It's not spiritual, it's real poverty. And Luke, in his beatitude, remember, what does he say? He doesn't say, blessed are the poor in spirit. What does he say? I'll admit, I've got a small audience to pick from. He just says, blessed are the poor. He doesn't add the in spirit. But Matthew adds this in spirit. Now, that is sometimes used to distinguish this phrase and make it say something like, something about voluntary poverty, like religious life, people who go into the monastery or something. Or sometimes it's like an inner attitude of poverty, right? So anybody can be poor. And and that's not to say I believe humility is a Christian virtue. And when we talk about the meekness, we'll get back to that. But I think it would be a mistake to divorce poor in spirit and make it just simply a spiritual state and divorce it from its social implications. Because what poor in spirit meant was that those who were suffering under under oppressive power, who were beaten down, and who are empty before God. So I think of the homeless in these cold days. I think of those struggling to hold on to their homes. I think of those who have fled violence in their lands. I think of the kids killed in Iran protesting. I think of those killed in our own country. I think of Howard Thurman's disinherited, those, he says, who had their backs up against the wall. These are the poor in spirit. And Jesus says today that they're the ones that are blessed. They're the ones that are blissful. They're the ones that are happy, which makes no sense, right? I mean, really, I know we can pretend. We can pretend that it makes sense to us. Yeah, that sounds right. But no one really wants to be poor or cold or wandering in foreign lands or victims of beatings by the state or worried about whether you can hold on to your home. And that may happen to us, but we don't want that. And yet the mystery of the Beatitude is that Jesus says literally, those are the beloved of God. And then he goes on to say this, blessed are those who mourn. Now, if you've ever mourned, it doesn't feel like a very happy state. Now, to understand this one, you have to go back to Isaiah 61. That's the chapter that starts, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor and to bind up the hearts of the brokenhearted. In a few verses down, Isaiah talks about those who mourn, and those are the ones who are mourning for Zion. Because in Isaiah's day, at least in the time of chapter 61, they were sore oppressed, as the Old English used to say. Babylon had come in and basically destroyed Jerusalem and deported the Jews. And so this was like the rupture of civil society. Laws were broken. The sacrilege was in the temple. And so they were mourning for this lost society. Mourning for a lost civility. Mourning for the loss of community. It's like Rachel who mourns for her lost children. You know that story, and Rachel cries for her children. It's the mourning of those who are suffering under strife. So what do we mourn for today? What have we lost in our own civil society? What are we losing? Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. These blessings, these beatitudes, they don't declare poverty good. They're not declaring mourning good. But what they show is that the present state will be reversed by God. That is what makes them blessed. Blessed are the peacemakers and those who hunger and thirst for justice. My gosh, if we have not drifted a long way from those pronouncements, do we really think that peacemakers are the happiest of all, that they are the blessed of God? Because if we do, we certainly don't act like it. We love a good fight, and many more of us find joy in a good put down or in violence. Crush our enemies. It's now the new sign of strength and manhood, and even sadly, Christianity. And that's not to say that the Beatitudes are teaching weakness. The word for meek means one who is a victim of the wicked. But not one who shrinks back from the wicked, but who faces the wicked no matter the consequences. Martin Luther King Jr. once said to his followers after he began receiving incredible threats to his life, "Even if you see me lying in the streets, bloodied and dying, do not retaliate with violence." That's meekness. The facing of the wicked with courage, no matter the consequences. It echoes, by the way, Psalm 37, when the meek are contrasted with the wicked who are persecuting the poor. Jesus describes himself, by the way, as a meek king who rides on the foal of the donkey and at his entry to Jerusalem. And the meek king was contrasted with the arrogant king. The meek king used his power on behalf of the poor. The arrogant king uses power for himself. Now, we've only really touched on some of the Beatitudes this morning, but they are commands to us all. They tell us who God favors, who God works with, who God works for. And it asks us to get in line beside them. And if we think we live our lives in harmony with the Beatitudes, I think we suffer under an illusion. But we must try. For the opposite of a blessing is shame and a curse. To act with malice and to lift up hate, to turn away from the suffering of the poor, to rejoice in ridicule and violence. All this is corrosive. If the Beatitudes teach us about the kingdom of heaven and how to invite it into our lives, then acting against them invites the demonic. So here's my version of the Beatitudes, how I might reframe them as sort of lessons for life. Be compassionate and be of service. Be kind and sacrifice your own comfort for the sake of others. Be mournful and sad when you see violence in word or deed. Make peace. Do justice. Walk humbly. Forgive and act with mercy. Be courageous and face wickedness with love. Now you might say that's too hard. I can't do that. And I'm with you, actually. I think it's hard too. And I think we often, though, we give a little too much credence to what we think is hard. We listen to our own whining a little too much. I know I do, and I can whine. I promise I can. But I believe the opposite of the Beatitudes is really what I said, a curse. Violence, rage, put-downs, hate, they are corrosive. And that path leads nowhere. So I'm going to end with a paraphrase of Paul's letter this morning. Give foolishness a chance. Amen.